Hello boys and girls, welcome back to Mr Mousey Beyond the Silver Sea. So we left Mr Rabbit, Mr Mousey and Nogger in the stone house, and Mr Mousey had some thoughts about coincidences that seemed to be happening in the stone house, that the rug seemed to fit a spot on the ground, that there was a picture in the wall that he had last seen in actually Owl's house. All very strange. So let's see what happens in chapter 23. South. The fire burned, the earth turned, and outside the stone house the little river tinkled on by. Creatures of the night went about their business, but in this forest there were very few of these. At night the forest was as still as a graveyard. Far away in another mountainous part of the forest, a dragon brooded darkly and nursed deep resentment and tended vengeful promises to itself. High above and removed from it all, a bright white moon cast its silver light onto the treetops, beneath which moon shadows ran like nymphs on the forest floor. The eastern sky paled once again and warmed with the coming arrival of the orange globe of a burning sun. What life within the forest dared to openly welcome the day did so and got it over with before spending the most of the daylight hiding and skulking in shadows. Inside the stone house things began to stir. To be more accurate, Mr Rabbit's stomach began to stir. Now, most of us are aware we are hungry when a small hungry feeling whispers a message from our stomach to our heads. In Mr Rabbit's case, this is more of a mad, demanding yell. "Oi, you! Yes, you!" says the food holding bit of his body to his thinking bit. "Food! We need food! And what are you going to do about it? Come on, brain! Up and at it! Grub, grub, grubbly grub! Food!" Well, Mr Rabbit's stomach is pretty insistent, and it's not an easy thing to sleep through. And once he's awake, he's not an easy thing to sleep through. So you don't. And neither did Nogger and Mr Mousey. "Are you awake then?" Mr Rabbit asked his two groaning friends. "Only since you are, perhaps it would be a good time for breakfast. If you're not doing anything else, that is." Well, there wasn't a whole lot of choice in the matter. So first Nogger, then Mr Mousey undid their bags and pulled themselves out into the morning. The room had cooled overnight, but some embers remained glowing in the fire. It only took a few moments to get the fire rekindled and have the teapot bubbling. Nogger popped out to the river again, and the two friends attempted to roll out the remainder of the squashed rolls in order to toast in front of the fire. As they sat with the bread turning on sticks before the fire, Nogger returned with the jug in one hand and his other hand covering the top. "Any of ye fancy a fish?" He spilled out the contents of the jug onto the table, and half a dozen small trout glistened like big silver teardrops. How did you—" began the mouse. "Ha ha!" said Nogger, patting his nose. "Us pirates is used to a fishing, specially us beaver ones." He was pleased with himself, especially since he had been able to be of some help to these two heroes. It was a fairly splendid breakfast, and at the end, Nogger and Mr Mousey felt they need never eat again. Mr Rabbit even managed to get his mind off dinner. It was hard to leave the little house. It had been so warm and safe there. For a minute he considered leaving the rug, especially since its magic seemed to have completely gone, but it was still useful as a sleeping mat amongst other things, so he packed it on top of his ruck as before. Before leaving, he took a good look at the room and the pictures on the wall. Apart from the forest and tower, there were two others, one of a lightly wooded island and another of a king, looking noble and kindly. Mr Rabbit and Nogger paused with Mr Mousey. "That there is King Benny's," said Nogger. Whoever owned this here house was a good un, seems to me. So, is Princess Jelana related to him then? Asked Mr Mousey. Nogger only hesitated for a small moment before answering. After all, these two had proved themselves and needed no secrets withheld. Princess Jelana is His Majesty's daughter. What about the other pictures? Where are they? Well, Nogger pouted out his bottom lip and thought, don't know. Maybe here? Maybe the tower? Well, he seemed to know as much about the other paintings as the rabbit and the mouse. There was a pause as Nogger and Mr Rabbit waited for the mouse, and with no other reason to wait, he turned and they all left the house, taking care to close the door behind them. So, where now? Asked the rabbit. South, I think, said the mouse, pulling the book out of its satchel. The map showed only a jumble of trees off the trails, and they weren't about to follow their previous route. He opened up and turned to the part marked Directions. Finding a map relating to the part of the forest they were in, he was amazed to find not only the trail they had been on the day before, but also the river they were presently beside, and a tiny square beside it simply marked Stone House. Between it and the trail was a little symbol of crossed swords. Battle of Fiery Trial was printed in text beside it. Glancing across at the trail, another set of crossed swords lay before the text. Ambush on Dragon. He was almost too flabbergasted to speak. It's all here, he stuttered. Even our meeting the dragon. It also showed a route off the main trail, following the river to the south, and from there to Descalador, the city. Well, let's go, he determined. Everybody ready? Happy as a happy thing, said Mr Rabbit with a grin. Lead on, skipper, added Nogger. And so off they set. For 2 days they followed the meandering course of the river as it twisted and turned. Although the forest seemed almost empty of any other life, the river teemed with fish. At least, at the rate Nogger was able to catch them, he made it look that way. Now and again they would hear a noise and dive into a nearby bush, but it would never turn out to be anything. Sometimes, to save time, Mr Mousey left the river when it meandered off the general direct southern route and led them instead over hills and outcrops. His map reading was good because they would always meet up with the river where it returned from its detour. At night they slept out in the open, huddled together under the rustling leaves above and the starry hosts twinkling beyond. Apart from fish, they found wild strawberries, raspberries and other forest fruits. The forest was not a place a woodland creature would find an excuse for starving in. On the second day, as they continued walking, Mr Mousey asked his friend about the stone house and how familiar it had seemed. Did he remember seeing it, or the paintings on the wall, anywhere? Mr Rabbit wrinkled his brow in thought before answering. Do you know, I'm glad you asked me that, he presently replied. When Nogger and I first ran into the little house, it didn't dawn on me till later how easily I found it. Well, how do you mean? Asked his pal. Well, you saw how well disguised it was, set back into the cliff and all. Well, Nogger never saw it at all. But as I turned the corner, I was actually feeling like I've been here before kind of a feeling. Deja vu, interrupted the mouse, who happened to have heard the French term explaining just that very sensation. Bless you two, said the rabbit before carrying on. And so I actually glanced over to where the house was, almost expecting to see it. And I did. Is that weird to you? Or is it just me? Yes, it is very strange, but where do you think you may have seen it before? he asked, wanting to see if his pal had come to the same conclusion as he. Mr. Rabbit shook his head. No, can't think. What about Owl's house? They walked along for a few more minutes before Mr. Rabbit suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. He spun his head around and looked at the mouse. Why? There's a picture, that very picture of that very house hanging on Owl's wall. And come to think of it, wasn't there one beside it, of the inside? Mr. Mousey was relieved it wasn't just his imagination after all. Yes, there was a picture of the inside of the house, he agreed, and I remember it really well because Owl took you aside for a moment to speak to you, and I looked aside to that very picture while you chatted. It was a picture of the very room we slept in last night, I'm sure of it. Except I remember seeing a fireside rug in the painting. Now I think about it, there were a lot of pictures on Owl's wall that start to mean something more than just pretty pictures. I can't think what it means. Wouldn't Owl be surprised? For some time they walked on, the mouse and the rabbit deep in thought, neither speaking, until at last Nogger broke the silence. So, how long does he think it'll take for us to get to the city then? Only I want to help and I can't think what I ought to be about until we get there. He does know it's guarded by at least 10,000 of them there nasty Discali soldiers, doesn't he? Oh dear. Well, that's the end of that chapter. Soldiers guarding the city. I haven't thought about that. Well, we'll have to find out in the next chapter what's going to happen. But thanks for listening again. The next chapter, if you want to go to it, is chapter 24 on YouTube. Thanks for listening. You take care, boys and girls. God bless.